Now we shall discuss clause 7 of the standard, that is support. The clause 7 has 5 subclauses, which are 7.1 resources, 7.2 competence, 7.3 awareness, 7.4 communication, 7.5 documented information. Let's start with subclause 7.1 resources. Subclause 7.1.1 General of ISO 9001 specifies that the organization is required to determine and provide the resources needed for the establishment, implementation, maintenance, and continual improvement of the quality management system. According to this subclause, the organization is required to consider the capabilities of and constraints on existing internal resources. Organization is also required to consider what needs to be obtained from external providers to meet the objectives of the organization. Now coming to subclause 7.1.2, people. The standard through the subclause 7.1.2, people, says that the organization is required to determine and provide the persons necessary for the effective implementation of its quality management system and for the operation and control of its processes. Now let's talk about subclause 7.1.3, infrastructure. As per the subclause 7.1.3, the organization is required to determine, provide and maintain the infrastructure necessary for the operation of its processes and to achieve conformity of products and services. It is specified under a note within subclause 7.1.2 that the infrastructure can include buildings and associated utilities, equipment including hardware and software, transportation resources, and information and communication technology. Coming to subclause 7.1.4, environment for the operation of processes. Subclause 7.1.4 says that the organization is required to determine, provide, and maintain the environment necessary for the operation of its processes and to achieve conformity of products and services. Under a note, the standard specifies that a suitable environment can be a combination of human and physical factors, such as social, psychological, and physical. Some of the examples of social factors are non-discriminatory, calm and non-confrontational, stress-reducing, burnout, prevention, and emotionally protective, etc. falls under the psychological factors. The examples of physical factors are temperature, heat, humidity, light, airflow, hygiene, and noise. As per subclause 7.1.4, these factors can differ substantially depending on the products and services provided. Let's talk about the subclause 7.1.5. Monitoring and measuring resources. The subclause 7.1.5.1 General states that the organization is required to determine and provide the resources needed to ensure valid and reliable results when monitoring or measuring is used to verify the conformity of products and services to requirements. Standard says that the organization must ensure that the resources provided are suitable for the specific type of monitoring and measurement activities being undertaken and are also maintained to ensure their continuing fitness for their purpose. Covering the mandatory documentation requirements, the subclause 7.1.5 specifies that the organization is required to retain appropriate documented information as evidence of fitness for the purpose of monitoring and measurement of the resources. Now, coming to subclause 7.1.5.2, measurement traceability. This subclause 7.1.5.2 of ISO 9001-2015 specifies that when measurement traceability is a requirement or is considered by the organization to be an essential part of providing confidence in the validity of measurement results, the measuring equipment is required to be calibrated or verified, or both. As per clause, calibration must be done at specified intervals or prior to use against measurement standards traceable to international or national measurement standards when no such standards exist. Clause 7.1.5.2 further states that the basis used for calibration or verification is required to be retained as documented information. As per this clause, measuring equipment must be identified in order to determine their status and be safeguarded from adjustments, damage, or deterioration that would invalidate the calibration status and subsequent measurement results. Lastly, the clause specifies that while measuring the equipment, if the validity of previous measurement results has been adversely affected, the organization is required to determine it and, if found to be unfit for its intended purpose, organization must take appropriate action as necessary. Let's talk about subclause 7.1.6, organizational knowledge. The subclause 7.1.6 of ISO 9000:2015 says that the organization is required to determine the knowledge necessary for the operation of its processes and to achieve conformity of products and services. As per clause 7.1.6, this knowledge is required to be maintained and be made available to the extent necessary. Further, according to this subclause, when addressing the changing needs and trends, the organization must consider its current knowledge and determine how to acquire or assess any necessary additional knowledge and required updates. Standard under Note 1 within this subclause states that the organizational knowledge is knowledge specific to the organization. It is generally gained by experience. It is information that is used and shared to achieve the organization's objectives. Under Note 2, the standard ISO 9001:2015 says that organizational knowledge can be based on internal sources, example, intellectual property, knowledge gained from experience, lessons learned from failures and successful projects, capturing and sharing undocumented knowledge and experience, the results of improvements in processes, products, and services. Organizational knowledge is also based on external sources, example, standards, academia, conferences, gathering knowledge from customers or external providers. Let me talk about subclause 7.2 of ISO 9001, that is, competence. According to this subclause 7.2, the organization is required to determine the necessary competence of the persons working under its control that affects the performance and effectiveness of the quality management system. Clause states that organization must ensure that these persons are competent on the basis of appropriate education, training, or experience. Subclause 7.2 specifies that an organization is required to take actions to acquire the necessary competence and evaluate the effectiveness of the actions taken wherever applicable. Lastly, the subclause 7.2 says that the organization is required to retain appropriate documented information as evidence of competence. Clause under a note mentions that applicable actions taken by the organization can include the provision of training, mentoring, or the reassignment of currently employed persons, or the hiring or contracting of competent persons. Now coming to subclause 7.3, awareness. The subclause 7.3 awareness of ISO 9001 specifies that the organization is required to ensure that persons doing work under the organization's control are aware of the quality policy, relevant quality objectives, and their contribution to the effectiveness of the quality management system, including the benefits of improved performance. As per this subclause 7.3, the organization is also required to ensure that the persons working under the organization's control are aware of the implications of not conforming to the quality management system requirements. Now let's talk about the subclause 7.4, communication. The subclause 7.4, communication, specifies that the organization is required to determine the internal and external communication relevant to the quality management system, including on what it will communicate, when to communicate, with whom to communicate, how to communicate, and who communicates. Let me explain the subclause 7.5, documented information. The subclause 7.5.1, General of ISO 9001, says that the organization's quality management system is required to include documented information required by this international standard. The quality management system is also required to include documented information determined by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of the quality management system. Subclause 7.5.1 under a note states that the extent of documented information for a quality management system can differ from one organization to another due to the size of the organization and its type of activities, processes, products, and services. The quality management system can also differ due to the complexity of processes and their interactions and the competence of persons. Now let me talk about the subclause 7.5.2, creating and updating. Subclause 7.5.2 says that when creating and updating documented information, the organization is required to ensure appropriate identification and description. For example, a title, date, author, or reference number, etc. Organization is also required to ensure the format, for example, language, version, graphics, and media, for example, paper, electronic, while creating and updating documented information. As per this subclause, the organization must review and approve the suitability and adequacy of documented information to meet the requirements of the standard. Let's discuss subclause 7.5.3, control of documented information. Subclause 7.5.3.1 states that the documented information required by the quality management system and by this international standard must be controlled to ensure that it is available and suitable for use where and when it is needed. The organization is also required to ensure that it is adequately protected, for example, from loss of confidentiality, improper use, or loss of integrity, etc. Coming to the subclause 7.5.3.2 now. This subclause specifies that for the control of documented information, the organization must address the activities like distribution, assess, retrieval, and use, storage and preservation, including preservation of legibility, control of changes, example version control, retention and disposition. Subclause 7.5.3.2 says that documented information of external origin determined by the organization to be necessary for the planning and operation of the quality management system must be identified as appropriate and be controlled. As per this clause, an organization must retain the documented information as evidence of conformity and must be protected from unintended alterations. Lastly, the subclause under a note states that access can imply a decision regarding the permission to view the documented information only, or the permission and authority to view and change the documented information. Friends, till now we have discussed the clause 7, support of ISO 9001-2015 Quality Management System. I sincerely thank you all for your interest and attention. Thank you and best wishes.